Well, thanks very much to the organizers of this webinar for the opportunity to share some ideas with you today. Let me summarize the core questions that I want to address. We all think, I suppose, that connection between human beings is a good thing. Does that mean that infinite connection between human beings and things online, which is what we have today, is a massively good thing? Well, we might assume so, but then we must also think about whether the social order that's being constructed through these connections, what if that order is on balance potentially a bad thing? Indeed, maybe a massively bad thing. That's the question I want to reflect upon. And let me stress, I won't be talking very much about traditional media, TV, press, or the radio. I agree with much of what's been said already, very much. But I'm going to be talking instead about the new form of data-driven media of the past 10 years. After all, where do most people get their news from? It's from Facebook, YouTube, their Google searches, their WhatsApp exchanges with friends and family. And I'll be talking above all about the forces that underlie the important role that personal data extraction is playing in the construction of platforms for the transmission of media today. And indeed, more than that, the role that platforms are playing in the conduct of social life itself. So let me start with 3 quotations from business commentators who see only advantages in the massive growth of online connection over the recent decades. First, of course, there are corporations who benefit hugely because more connection means more opportunities for extracting value through data. Here, for example, is the chief executive of Microsoft commenting just after Microsoft had bought LinkedIn 5 years ago, where he said the core capability of being able to create value comes from being able to do machine learning and AI at scale. But to do that, you need data, hence the need for Microsoft to purchase LinkedIn. And then there are the marketers who see more connection as the means to simplify our lives and at the same time their lives. Here's the new marketing philosophy of what's called continuous connection, touted in the Harvard Business Review from 2 years ago. The highest stage of this new marketing model is so-called automatic execution. In an automatic execution marketing strategy, the customer authorizes the company to take care of the execution, and from then on, the company handles everything. What does this mean? Well, the authors explain, it means that if you have a smart fridge, the smart fridge knows when you're about to run out of milk, and it orders more milk, so it's there when you need it. But then the authors say, quotes, that naturally we only do that after checking your calendar to make sure you're not going on vacation. So this model of marketing obviously requires integrating a lot more personal data than we might first meet the eye. But all of this is about much more than making our lives convenient. It's about reshaping the whole of social space into a network of sensors which continuously extract data from things and people. Here is Thomas Siebel, the author of Digital Transformation, who says that in a few years, virtually everything will have become a computer, from eyeglasses to pill bottles, heart monitors, refrigerators, etc. The basic idea of the Internet of Things, he says, is to connect any device to the Internet so that it can send and receive data. It should be obvious, these are not trivial changes these writers are talking about. They're actually revolutionary changes for all of them. So we have to ask, what is really happening here? For the business commentators, they talk about opportunities for business, for marketing, even for human knowledge. So Siebel, the last writer I quoted, says that more data will, quotes, extend the length and quality of human life. Or could it be that we're seeing something rather different from that? That what we're really seeing here is the reconfiguration of social life itself, the reorganization of everything we as human beings interact with for one end, to optimize the extraction of data for value. And if that's right, then what we're seeing is another way of looking at the instrumentalization of human life for corporate goals. Now, to help us reflect on that possibility, what might be at stake in it, let me quote from Pope Francis himself from the encyclical from 2015 on climate change and inequality, which talks absolutely rightly, I think, about the problem that humanity has taken up technology in its development according to a one-dimensional paradigm that exalts a human subject who, using rational procedures, progressively approaches and gains control over an external object, attempting to extract everything possible from it while frequently ignoring or forgetting the reality in front of us. Now, as I'm sure you'll realize, that quotation wasn't originally concerned with talking about computers particularly, or data, but I think it fits very well with our uses of data that I'm talking about. And it fits particularly well with a prediction of the consequences of our instrumentalized use of technology and computers that astonishingly was made at the dawn of the computer age. And it was made by the author of one of computing's most famous books, Cybernetics, by mathematician and philosopher Norbert Wiener, who wrote in the introduction to his first edition that it's long been clear to me that the modern ultra-rapid computing machine was in principle a central nervous system to an apparatus for automatic control. Now, he was writing just 2 years even after the end of the Second World War. So his next sentence is particularly significant. Long before public awareness of the atomic bomb, it had already occurred to me that we were here with computing in the presence of another social potentiality of unheard of importance for good and for evil. Now, he wrote that introduction from Mexico City in November 1947, and he ended it by saying, there are those who hope that the good of a better understanding of man and society, which is offered by this new field of cybernetics, may outweigh the incidental contribution we're making to the concentration of power. I write in 1947, he said, and I'm compelled to say that this is a very slight hope. So his prediction was an extremely pessimistic one, and yet it's been largely ignored in the 8 decades that followed. Which leads us to ask, how then did we get here? It's much too easy to imagine a vast corporate conspiracy to rule the world for evil purposes. Instead, what's gone on is a number of converging developments, none of which would have been decisive on their own, but which taken together have come to change the very nature of the social order. Let me summarize them. The first is very basic. The basic feature of computers that they have a memory. They need to have a memory in order to work. That means that computers capture the changes of state that goes on. So any input that fits with what Philip Ager called the grammar of action of a computer gets stored in the computer. In other words, if I type a certain instruction on my computer keyboard, that is stored in the computer memory. If I just smile at my keyboard, that doesn't fit the computer's grammar of action, so it isn't stored. Now, that basic fact of computers becomes much more significant when computers become connected, as they did in the early 1990s on a large scale, so that one computer can capture data on other computers. And this becomes even more significant when the internet as a space of connection of computers becomes itself commercialized, no longer driven by public values, which is what's happened when in the early 90s, the space of computer connection was reorganized around commercial web browsers, the growth of huge corporate intranets, the advertisers exploiting the cookie to track us in what we do on our computers. The key step then emerged with online platforms, which emerged in the first years of the century as interfaces that would reconfigure social and economic interactions around the capture and processing of data. And then a decisive phase, which emerged throughout the first decade of this century, was when, as Professor Stiglitz was just saying, the business models of these platforms, such as Facebook, but Google had already been doing this for some years, in fact, the business models became oriented around exploiting data value for targeted advertising. And this is the core of what underlies fake news, because bad news, bad information circulates faster, generating more data extraction, which benefits the business model. All of this has led to the normalization of data extraction through the tracking of users as the basis of social and economic life, and increasingly the basis of government. And this is now being intensified even further. So businesses are increasingly tracking not just people and what we do online, but things themselves. Now, these are complex and separate developments, but taken together, they present us, I believe, with a turning point in human history, a moment of genuine choice when we have to decide whether we want to continue down this path or whether we absolutely need to step back and consider another direction. To help us make this choice, we probably need some theoretical frameworks to make sense of what's going on here at the largest scale. And there are lots of theories. I don't have much time, so let me just mention two of them. First, and very well known, of course, is Shoshana Zuboff's theory of surveillance capitalism. Zuboff argues that what we're seeing here is the emergence in one part of capitalism of a new form, a branch variant, if you like, a rogue variant of capitalism, which is focused on exploiting human surveillance assets taken from tracking us online, and so resulting in a new mode of capitalist accumulation. Now, a great strength of Zuboff's account is its focus on the ruthless targeting of personal data by corporations such as Google and Facebook. And she builds from that to look at the ambition of some marketers today that's developed for influencing behavior by using the amassed contextual data that we have about human beings online. There's also, though, a second theory which I want to mention to you, which I've been working on myself with Mexican writer Ulysses Mejias, which is a theory of data colonialism. This argues that what's going on with data today is not just about capitalism. Obviously, it is about capitalism, but it's also about a new form, indeed a new stage of colonialism, a new stage of colonialism as it unfolds in history, which, similarly to Zuboff, we argue, is involved in appropriating not land and minerals and the bodies to work the land, but appropriating human life itself, which will in future make possible a radically new capitalism that exploits human life without any limits in the form of data. Let me say a little bit more about how what's going on with data and digital platforms might be connected, not just with capitalism, but with colonialism. Now, colonialism from the start relied on claims that the land it seized was just there for the taking. It didn't belong to anyone. It was asserted it was a terra nullius, the phrase of the time, the legal fiction. Similar claims were made about the labor necessary to work the land, that it was cheap, it was available there on the ground, and it was just available, so why not take advantage of it? And we see something similar, Ulysses and I argue, with data today. We're told the data is just there. It's often called an exhaust that we just give off somehow as we move around online. We don't own it. We can't do anything with it. So why not allow corporations to take it and make some good out of it? That's a very common argument in the business discourse around big data. This demand to acquire big data today in its many forms, whether it's by corporations, governments, development organizations, we argue within the data colonialism framework is actually a repetition of that other crucial world historical event at the start of the original colonialism, when the world's assets were seized by colonial powers. I haven't got time to go into much detail, But clearly it makes a difference which theory today we choose to make sense of what's happening with data. Do we stay with the model of surveillance capitalism, which is a powerful one, in which case our priority today will be to reform the rogue digital platforms like the Facebooks, Google, Alibaba, to focus on changing them and not be concerned with the rest of capitalism. But to worry about that when we think about how widespread the extraction of data is in daily life today is that we wouldn't even begin to be covering problematic data extraction in other areas, in commercial transactions, in logistics, which always involves tracking not just things, but the people who are moving the things, or indeed the massive growth in workplace surveillance in the past 5 or 10 years through computer tracking, or the role of algorithms and data extraction in social welfare, or in health, or in education. Children are being tracked routinely by their schools, or rather by the platforms that provide the educational platforms for their schools today, or indeed in development projects. If we think about these wider possibilities, then the question is, should we, following this analysis of data colonialism, be challenging at the broadest level the instrumentalization of life for data, wherever it occurs, in whatever form it occurs? There are actually two dimensions to what's harmful to the instrumentalization of life for data. The one we talk about most, the most obvious, is the harmful uses of data for commercial and state purposes. Obviously, that needs to be regulated. But underlying that is an even deeper threat, which is the threat to human freedom, the basic space from where we are free to act, from the fact that we are increasingly now being tracked the whole time by external entities. We can deepen our understanding of what's going on with data most by drawing on decolonial thinking itself. And here I'm thinking of the concept of coloniality developed by Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano. Because both aspects of the instrumentalization of life for data that I talked about reflects something bigger and more historical, which is an instrumentalization of the world for power and for technology that Quijano argued is part of 500 years of colonial history and persists even after the imperial institutions of empire collapsed, many of them in the 1960s. Coloniality continues. And yet Quijano developed an alternative vision of how history could develop, which is his idea that there could be another rationality for organizing human life better, another way of organizing social life, which, as he puts it, not only does not deny, but actually requires the idea of another, of a diverse, different other that has to be respected. And a vision for Quijano that emphasizes the diversity of human life, the diversity of free human life that persists in spite of data categories, in spite of algorithmic targeting. And I believe that although it was developed 30 years ago for an era before social media platforms, I believe that we actually need Quijano's alternative vision of rationality today to help us face the challenges posed by what's going on with data and technology. So to sum up, what I'm saying is that humanity today is faced with something truly new. It's faced with the attempt by commercial corporations, with or without government support, but all the time on the largest possible scale, the attempt of corporations to reconstruct the social world for profit, to reconstruct the social world for corporate ends, and especially for the end of optimizing the extraction of data for profit. To put it bluntly, life has never been instrumentalized at this depth in history before. So in response, we need something more than an individual personal ethics. That cannot be enough. What we need is a social vision that addresses and challenges how our society's order is today being transformed under our eyes for commercial and technological ends and not social ends. We need a vision that not only imagines alternatives, but begins to think about how, through solidarity, and of course through regulation and government and social action, how through those means we could build alternative practices, alternative ways of connecting between human beings without this massive reliance on data extraction. And that vision, I believe, is what, with some urgency, we need to build together today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you. Thank you.